Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are opening up a source that takes a topic many of you might recognize, Gestalt Language Processing, or GLP, and it uses a framework so unexpected it completely rewrites the argument.
It's a really phenomenal piece of scholarship. It shifts the whole conversation from, the clinical to the political. The source we're diving into is the article Borderlands of Meaning, Gestalt Language Processing, and the Policing of Knowing by Jaime Hoerricks.
And the premise here is instantly arresting. I mean, the author works as a GLP literacy specialist, and they argue that the current seemingly scientific pushback against GLP, well, it's not a neutral scientific disagreement at all. It's actually something much, much bigger.
Right. And our mission today is really to unpack that claim. We're trying to go beyond that technical dispute to look at the author's argument that this entire conflict, it's really a struggle over who gets to define what language even is.
And whose methods are seen as valid, right?
Exactly. And ultimately, what even constitutes accepted knowledge.
And here's what makes this so fascinating. The author's insight didn't come from, say, a deep dive into developmental psychology. It came, as they put it, sideways.
Yeah, that part is amazing. The author was taking professional development in Chicano studies, specifically Chicano literature, to better support their predominantly Latinx students.
So they were looking for cultural context.
Hoping to find frameworks to help understand diverse communication styles. But what they found, almost by accident, was a set of theoretical concepts about existing between two cultures.
And those concepts immediately began to, and this is a quote, illuminate a different struggle, the one they were seeing every day with GLP learners.
Okay, so let's unpack this reframing because it really challenges that polite narrative. We need to understand the stakes. When we usually hear about the conflict around GLP, how is it typically framed?
Well, it's framed in these very manageable, safe ways.
Right? It is. It's contained within professional norms. The source gives a clear list. They call it a technical dispute, or a disagreement over evidence, maybe just a methodological quarrel.
Or the big one, a question of rigor.
That's the one. And that framing is neat, it's familiar, it makes it sound like two camps of researchers are just, politely disagreeing over data in a journal.
Right. It implies that the best science will eventually just win out and the whole thing will fade away.
Exactly. And the source immediately pushes back, calling that framing neat, familiar, and profoundly misleading. The argument is that this story, this narrative, it masks the true conflict.
Because if you only focus on the data points,
the
what, you miss the struggle over the why.
You do. So if we look beneath the surface of the technique, what is the core conflict then? It sounds like we're moving out of science and into philosophy.
We absolutely are. The author argues this is not a neutral scientific debate. It is, in their words, epistemic.
Okay, so for you listening, epistemic means relating to knowledge itself. But what does an epistemic conflict actually look like in, say, a school or a clinic?
Well, it means the disagreement isn't about whether an intervention helps a child communicate. It's about whether the form of that communication is recognized as valid knowledge by the institution.
The stakes are just immense because the conflict is, and I'm quoting here, quote, over who gets to define language, whose coherence counts, and which ways of knowing are allowed to exist without translation into institutional norms.
Wow. That just raises the stakes completely. You're not just debating an intervention model. You're debating whether an entire way of communicating even qualifies as legitimate unless it's translated into the standardized format the system demands.
Precisely. For example, if a child communicates beautifully using whole memorized scripts gestalts, but struggles to break them down into single words on a test.
Standardized test says they failed.
Right. The conflict is about whether that child's innate, meaningful coherence should be judged by the institution's need for segmentation, for linear progression.
And that systemic friction is why this unexpected framework Chicano Borderlands Theory became so illuminating for the author. They saw a parallel there.
A huge parallel between the historical struggle of marginalized people whose languages were deemed substandard and the current treatment of GLP learners. It's the catalyst for the entire piece.
So what are the specific frameworks from that theory that suddenly shone a light on this? This is where we shift from a technical dispute to something much deeper.
Okay, so there are three main concepts the author uses, and they are incredibly powerful when you apply them to cognition. The first is the idea of the borderlands itself.
So not just the physical border between countries?
No, not at all. It's the conceptual space where cultures clash and they blend and they create these hybrid realities. When you apply that to language, that borderland is the space between the Gestalt way of knowing and the dominant linear analytic way.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second concept?
The second is nepantla. It's a Nahuatl word, and it's often described as an in-between state, a place of constant transition, flux, struggle. A person in nepantla isn't fully in one world or the other.
So how does that look in a child who's learning language through GLP?
A child in the nepantla of language acquisition is constantly transitioning. They're collecting these whole units, their gestalts, which have profound meaning to them. But they haven't yet broken them down into the single-word currency that the school system requires.
So they're coherent, but they're not compliant.
That's a perfect way to put it. They're operating in that in-between space where their meaning is valid, but their form is constantly being questioned.
That perfectly explains that feeling of being misunderstood, which is so core to the Borderlands experience. And the third concept, mestiza consciousness, that feels like the most profound one here.
It is. Mestiza consciousness is the ability to hold multiple, often conflicting worldviews at the same time. It's the cognitive strength you need to live in the Borderlands.
So if we apply that to language acquisition, it suggests the GLP speaker isn't just someone who uses scripts. They are, by necessity, developing a consciousness that understands both their meaning-first world and the institution's segmentation-first world. They're basically interpreters.
Yes. And that ability to interpret, to translate their internal coherence into the form that's demanded externally, it's exhausting. And it's often penalized.
Right.
The source argues that this cognitive load, this internal struggle, is what the current system is just failing to recognize. The conflict isn't just about processing, it's about the burden placed on those who live in the borderlands of meaning.
Which makes perfect sense. If you define language acquisition in a way that inherently involves being in this in-between state, you're already defining it outside of rigid linear systems. And the source explicitly reframes the whole GLP backlash.
It does. It moves it from a simple scientific debate to something much more active, more charged. Epistemic border policing.
Which suggests an active effort to guard the borders of what is considered acceptable knowledge.
And forcing assimilation into the dominant analytic structure.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. We have to define what GLP is under this new lens and what it is not. Because for so long, mainstream models have seen it almost as a failure mode, a deviation that needs to be corrected.
And that's the critical distinction the source makes. If you stick to the standard linear model, then any deviation is going to look like a flaw. But the author is very strong on what GLP is not.
Right.
It is not a developmental glitch. It is not a workaround for a non-standard brain trying to mimic normal development.
It's not a pit stop on the way to the real destination.
Precisely. It is not, and I'm quoting, a temporary deviation en route to analytic language. The author insists that GLP is, for these learners, the primary valid route to language.
So if it's not a deviation, then what is it? What's the affirmative definition here?
GLP is defined, fundamentally, as a Borderlands way of knowing. It's an inherent cognitive process that views the world and language through a nonlinear, synthesized lens. It starts with meaning first.
And what are the defining characteristics of this Borderlands cognition? I mean, what are the mechanics that challenge that linear system?
The source details four main attributes. It is meaning first, hold apart, recursive, and relational. Let's just think about what that means in practice.
Okay, let's ground it. A typical analytic learner might hear, I want juice. And they immediately get the parts. I want juice. They can recombine them.
Right. But the GLP Borderlands learner starts with coherence. They might hear, it's time for a snack, as one single whole unit, a gestalt.
And that unit doesn't just mean snack.
No, it means the whole routine.
Right.
Sitting at the table, the specific cup, the feeling of comfort, the interaction. It is inherently meaning first and hold apart.
The emphasis is on that initial coherence, that meaning held intact. It's a complete communication bundle.
Exactly. And that initial coherence is the source of the conflict with institutions. This way of knowing doesn't begin with the steps that are fundamental to our institutional models. It doesn't start with segmentation, extraction, or linear progression.
It starts with coherence, held intact. And that structural difference is where the systemic friction begins. Because if your entire educational or diagnostic system is built on segmenting and measuring linear steps A to B to C a process that starts with the whole already coherent is, it's disruptive. It resists measurement.
It creates an immediate institutional barrier. If a diagnostic tool requires a child to isolate a single sound, the GLP learner has to stop being a coherent communicator and start acting like an analytic one just to comply with the test.
And the source makes a really powerful claim about this.
It does. It says this inherent, meaning first nature, places GLP at odds with systems built to measure, standardize, and discipline language into compliant forms.
So the source isn't saying that people in these institutions are malicious.
No, not at all. It's saying the structure of the institutions is inherently biased against this kind of nonlinear cognition. The system is designed for extraction and compliance. It wants to pull out the individual data points that confirm its linear model.
And if a child's knowledge is holistic and recursive, meaning they loop back to the whole to understand the parts, that knowledge is immediately deemed non-compliant or deviant.
Because it doesn't fit the expected linear progression. It's treated like a foreign language that has to be translated into the institutional norm to even gain entry.
Which leads to the conclusion the author draws about why this fight is happening now. Because this way of knowing, this Borderlands nepantla cognition, it's seen as a threat to the established order.
It's seen as a threat because, by its very nature, it undermines the established rules of evaluation. And evaluation is key to everything in those systems: funding, resources, careers. The source concludes that this way of knowing threatens institutions built on extraction, compliance, and linear time.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Maybe you're reading research on NLA, or maybe you're invested in this for someone you care about. The key takeaway here is that seeing GLP as a Borderlands way of knowing it fundamentally changes the conversation.
It shifts it entirely. It moves it from a simple debate over efficacy, does this work, to a political conversation about power and systemic bias. It forces us to ask, are we genuinely measuring how well the model creates meaning, or are we just measuring the speaker's compliance to an institutional expectation of linearity?
And when systems prioritize segmentation, they are, as the author argues, actively policing the borders of acceptable cognition. That idea of epistemic border policing really sticks with you.
It does. It suggests that when a child is diagnosed with a deficit because their communication is nonlinear, the real deficit might be in the system's ability to recognize that meaning.
The mestiza consciousness of the speaker is being penalized because they operate in a space the institution can't easily standardize or certify.
Exactly. It's forcing institutions to recognize that coherence can exist outside of their measurable framework. That is the revolutionary part of this work.
It's a profound way to look at how we measure and validate knowledge. So let's leave you with this provocative thought, based on that argument over whose coherence counts.
Yeah, consider how many disagreements you see in education, in your workplace, wherever, that are framed as purely technical or scientific. Are they truly neutral debates over the best evidence?
Or are they, underneath that familiar layer of rigor, actually struggles over institutional compliance versus these nonlinear, meaning first ways of knowing?
If you start seeing these conflicts as struggles against systems built on extraction, compliance, and linear time, you might find the real tension isn't in the facts themselves, but in the institutional demand for assimilation.
This deep dive into the borderlands of meaning gives us a whole new lens to evaluate not just language, but the systems that seek to define and control knowledge itself. We hope this gives you new insight into the complex reality of language acquisition.